Everyone know. We are recording today's session to be used and shared with other asylum applicants. My name is Jenny Guilfoyle. I'm the legal director at a nonprofit organization called VICINA, where we provide legal training and materials to help attorneys represent primarily at this point Afghan asylum applicants, along with other humanitarian-based applications. And we are presenting this session today with the aim of helping Afghan asylum applicants understand the asylum interview part of the asylum process. So I will be leading today's session along with a wonderful volunteer colleague, Annalisa Lindsay, who is coming to us from the Welcome Legal Alliance. And we are very grateful to the Welcome Legal Alliance generally for helping us make today's session possible. Annalisa has a lot of knowledge about asylum law. She herself was previously a refugee officer with the US Citizenship and Immigration Services. So what we're going to be talking about in today's session is the asylum interview, which is the culminating, the end part of the asylum application process. And the way today's session is going to work, and I see several of you already have questions and have raised your hands. So I'm glad that everybody brought questions. And we're hoping that we can answer a lot of your questions during today's session. The way that the session will work is that Annalisa and I are going to do a presentation for you and talk about the asylum interview. We're going to talk about what an asylum interview is, who an asylum officer is, who conducts the interview, what happens during that interview, how do you get to the asylum office, what it's like when you get there, what kind of questions you'll be asked, how to answer those questions, how best to prepare for the interview. We'll even play you a little clip from a mock asylum interview, so you really get an even better sense of what to expect. We definitely want to cover your questions. You're not going to be able to speak during the webinar because it's not set up that way. We ask that you put any questions that you have into the question and answers as the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We will try our hardest to answer some of them during the session, and then we've also left some time at the end to read out and answer some of your questions. So with that, I'm going to move ahead to our next slide and turn things over to Annalisa.
Hi, Jenny, can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Jenny. I'm really excited to see many participants here. We're very excited. I know that a lot of folks have probably already lodged asylum applications, or you might be early in that stage. It might be coming up to the interview part of the process. So we hope that this information will be useful to you. As Jenny mentioned, the Q&A button, I think, is at the bottom of your screen. So if you click that, you can type in your question. We will receive that and we'll address those here live at the end of the demonstration. And then if we're not able to get to all of them, we'll be trying to share some of the answers out otherwise. Unfortunately, if folks are asking case-specific questions, we don't have that information today. So that isn't the right forum to ask that question. But if you want to ask general questions about the process, we're happy to try to answer those. So we'll go ahead and start with, what is the purpose of the asylum interview? So first off, there are multiple stages of the asylum application in the US. The first stage is submitting your I-589 form, the declaration or personal statement, and all the evidence that goes along with that. And you will either submitted that by mail or electronically. And that's the first stage. After the asylum application has been submitted to the US government, an applicant will be invited to an interview, and an appointment will be scheduled for them. Our experience I know we have folks here on the line also who are from Afghanistan, you may be from other countries as well. The experience that may vary in terms of the time between lodging your application and when you are invited to interview. Some people, it may be a very short window between the application and the interview, and some people may have to wait longer. There's usually nothing that anyone can do about that wait. So the important thing is just to be ready and to do work like this and preparing for when that interview could happen. So thank you all for being here. The purpose of the asylum interview is for the US government to meet you in person, meet any family members that are on your case, and to hear you tell your story in person. It's one thing for them to receive all of this paper and this documentation. It's a whole nother level of importance for a US official, an asylum officer, to meet you in person and have this conversation with you. They want to hear your story. They also need to, from requirements from US law, assess your credibility. What is credibility? Credibility means whether or not you are telling the truth. And that's one of the utmost important things and utmost important parts of the asylum interview, is that you tell the truth. Also in the interview, the asylum officer will be able to take information that you share and decide whether or not you qualify for protection in the United States according to US laws. And only after the interview will they decide whether to grant or deny asylum. Your interview will be with a US asylum officer who works for the US Citizenship and Immigration Services, or USCIS. And USCIS is part of the US Department of Homeland Security, and they're the ones in charge of deciding asylum cases. The asylum officer is specifically trained to hear and to decide or adjudicate asylum cases. They're not a judge, they're not police or law enforcement. And as I mentioned, it's only after the interview that the asylum officer will make a decision. There will be no final decision on the day of your interview. So you can try to ask, but the officers will always say there is no decision on the same day. So if you don't receive a decision, don't worry, don't panic, it's not bad, it's normal. But it's only after the interview that you will receive official notice of approving or denying the case. Now over to Jenny for a bit about the logistics and what to expect.
Thank you so much, Annalisa. So now I want to talk about beyond the purpose of the interview. What is it? How do you get there? What is the asylum office? Who is the asylum officer? And what happens when you actually physically go to your asylum interview? So the asylum officer, well, the asylum office is a part of US Citizenship and Immigration Services, which is itself part of the US Department of Homeland Security. US Citizenship and Immigration Services is the part of the Department of Homeland Security that's in charge of deciding whether or not to give people immigration benefits, like asylum. And they have a whole special division called the Asylum Office that is just in charge of deciding people's asylum applications. And the Asylum Office has physical locations in, I think, 12 cities around the country, but they also then may do asylum interviews at other locations. So there are really physical offices for the Asylum Office in many states around the country. And so if you're going for an asylum interview, that's hopefully going to be somewhere in your own state that you're living in, or a close by state. And what do the asylum offices look like? Well, this is a photograph of the outside of the Chicago Asylum Office. It's just in an office building. A lot of times the asylum office itself will just be located in some large office building that you'll go to, and like there'll be a special floor that just has the USCIS Asylum Office. And who is the asylum officer? The asylum officer is the person who's going to be interviewing you on your asylum case, and that person works for US Citizenship and Immigration Services. They're not a judge, so asylum office is not court, and asylum officers are not judges. They are employees of the US Citizenship and Immigration Services who get special training to understand asylum law and how to do asylum interviews, and are allowed to make decisions on those. Some of them are lawyers. Probably my guess is maybe half of them happen to be lawyers, but that's actually not required for their job even. So some of them aren't lawyers, and they're definitely not judges. All they do all day long is read people's asylum applications and interview them and make decisions about their cases. That's their whole job. So what happens when you get to this physical building? So it might be in a big office building, and you'll be told on your appointment notice what floor to go to when you get to that building. When you get up to the asylum office floor, you're going to see that you're going to need to go through, to get into the asylum office itself, you'll need to go through a metal detector. And you'll also, they have a scanner for your bags, like at the airport. You'll have to take off your shoes, you'll have to take off your belt, and any bags that you brought with you will go through the scanner, and you'll go through the metal detector. You might even have to wait on a little bit of a line to do that. Once you do that, there's another line to wait in. There's lots of waiting when you first get to the asylum office before your interview. You're going to have to wait in a line with your appointment notice that you got saying that this is the day of your asylum interview. And there you're waiting to like let the asylum office know, hey, I'm here and I'm ready for my interview. So you wait in that line, and when they call you up to the front, they will ask to see your appointment notice, and then they're going to want to know your name, and they're going to want to take your fingerprints and a photo of you. They want to make sure that you are exactly the person listed on that notice. And then they will check off like, okay, this applicant is here, and they'll tell you to go and sit and wait. And so you'll be in a big waiting room. There'll be lots of chairs, probably many other asylum applicants, some of them with their families, some of them with lawyers, some not with lawyers, all sitting and waiting in the waiting room. Most of the waiting rooms have a bathroom right there in like attached to the waiting room. Sometimes you have to go out in the hallway to do that. And you're going to wait there until the asylum officer who's assigned to your case is going to come out and call you back to the asylum interview. You may be waiting there for quite a while, so that's something to be prepared for. It's very, very, very normal to have to wait for quite a while in the waiting room. It just depends how long the interview before yours went, and you never know. So you could be waiting 5 minutes, you could be waiting an hour or more. You just wait patiently and they will call you. You may see sometimes people who came in after you get called before you. That's normal and nothing to be concerned about. They assign cases to specific officers, and every interview takes a different length of time. So it's very normal for that to happen and not something to be worried about. When an officer finally comes out for your case, they're going to call you back for your interview, not by your name. They're going to use the last 3 numbers of your A number. And your A number is like your special identifying number in the US immigration system. And you'll find that number. It should be listed on your asylum application itself. You're required to put it there. It'll be on your work authorization card, the EAD card, your work card. It will be on your asylum appointment notice. And it's usually a 9-digit number. And I think for Afghans, almost all A numbers start right now with 241. They're not going to call you by those numbers because everyone has those. They're going to look at the last 3 numbers of your A number. That's how they call you. Just a few other things that I want to talk about before I talk about what happens during the interview. Some other things to think about. You might be wondering, what am I supposed to wear to this? And what I always tell my own clients is that you want to be wearing clothes that you feel comfortable in. You know, the asylum interview it's an important interview and it can feel very stressful. So you don't want to wear clothes that are going to make you feel stressed and uncomfortable. You want to dress in a way that shows the respect for the asylum office, however you interpret that, and clothes that you're comfortable in. This is what I tell my own clients.
We are providing updated information regarding interpreters at asylum interviews. As of September 13th, 2023, USCIS announced that all affirmative asylum applicants must bring their own interpreters to their asylum interviews. This means that the interpreter must appear in person with you at your asylum interview. Your interpreter cannot appear by phone. This also means that USCIS is no longer allowing interpreters to be called by phone once you arrive at your interview. So let's talk about who can be an interpreter. So an interpreter must be someone who is of age 18 years or older, and they must be fluent in Dari or Pashto in English, or if you prefer another language, that's your best language. But they must be fluent in both of those languages. Also, you want to make sure that your interpreter understands you, and also that you understand your interpreter. If for some reason you're running into the issue where you're noticing that the interpreter is not catching what you're saying, or that you are not clearly communicating with the interpreter what you're trying to say, you need to speak up immediately and let the asylum officer know. Do not wait until the end of your asylum interview to let the asylum officer know that you didn't understand your interpreter. Unfortunately, the asylum officer will probably not be able to go back and start the interview all over again. Um, let's also discuss who cannot be an interpreter for your interview. So first, if a family member who is a derivative on your application, such as your spouse or any children, they cannot be interpreters for your interview. Also, if someone is a witness to your case, this means if they wrote a statement in support of your case, wrote an affidavit, somehow tried to share some information about your case with the asylum office, they cannot be your interpreter. If someone is an asylum applicant, they currently have their own asylum application, but they have not yet attended their interview. They are not allowed to go and be the interpreter at your interview. They must have already attended their own interview before they can interpret it for others. If you know someone who's a representative or an employee of the Afghan government, they are not allowed to be your interpreter as well. And also, if you do have an attorney or an accredited representative who is representing you at your asylum application, they cannot sit in the interview and be your interpreter as well as your attorney or accredited representative. So again, these are just some updates we wanted to provide, and we wish you all the best at your interview.
What else do you need to bring with you the day of the interview? You should bring your original identity documents. So if you have a passport, you'll want to bring that. If you have a tazkira, you're going to want to bring that. If you have a US work card, an EAD, you should bring that as well. Also bring water. They say that they don't allow you to eat at the asylum office. And so if you need to bring food to eat while you're waiting, you might need to leave the building or go out in the hallway to eat your food. They say that they won't allow that in the asylum office, but you absolutely can bring water. And if you're bringing family members, including children, it can be a long time to wait in the waiting room. So you'll certainly want to bring some toys or something else to entertain the children while they're waiting there, because the asylum office waiting room doesn't have anything for children in it. Okay, so I'm going to now talk a little bit about what actually, and I actually went through this slide. This is a photo here of the outside of the Arlington, Virginia Asylum Office. So you can see it's another government building there. And who has to come to the interview? So I mentioned your spouse and child. So who has to come? If you're applying for asylum on your own, you are the principal applicant under in the US immigration system. If you are the person whose name and information is at the top of the I-589 asylum application, if you have your spouse and or your children who are unmarried and under 21 with you in the United States, they can be what's called derivatives on your asylum application. And so they don't have to file their own separate asylum applications. If you're granted asylum, they'll be granted asylum along with you, and they don't have to prove their own case. If you want that to happen, they need to be listed on your asylum application, and then they need to come to the interview. So even though they're not going to be fully interviewed themselves the same way the principal applicant will be, they all have to come, no matter what age the children, no matter how young your child is, they need to come to the asylum interview in order to be considered for a grant of asylum. So now we want to talk about what happens during the asylum interview. And so this is really the most, the heart of this presentation is about what happens during the asylum interview itself. So this is the US government asylum officer's opportunity to ask every asylum applicant about why they're applying for asylum. And as an asylum applicant yourself, this is your opportunity to tell your story and explain to this officer why it is that you're afraid to return home. And because this interview preparation orientation is really was prepared on behalf of people from Afghanistan who are applying for asylum. This is why I left Afghanistan here as the country. Of course, if you're from a different country, the questions would be about why you're afraid to return to that other country. So what is the officer going to be asking? First, the officer will start off, and we'll see this in the mock interview that we look at in a few minutes, by asking you to raise your right hand and swear to tell the truth during the interview. That happens at the beginning of every interview. The officer may also ask some opening questions about how you're feeling, and if you've taken any medications, if you have any medical conditions that would make it hard for you to tell your story. And if that's the case for you, that would be important to let the officer know those things right up front. The officer is then going to be asking questions about your Form I-589. That's that long immigration form that you have to fill out to apply for asylum that asks lots of details about your life. It asks you to list all the names you've ever used, your date of birth, when you arrived in the United States, where you arrived in the United States, the names of all your siblings and your parents, the names of your spouse and your children and their dates of birth, and every place you've ever worked and gone to school, all those questions. The officer is going to have the form that you prepared and that you filled out. The officer will be asking you, did anyone help you prepare this form? So that's a normal thing that they ask everyone. And if anyone did help you prepare the form, that's absolutely fine and allowed, and you would just explain that to the officer. If somebody did help you prepare it, the officer will want to understand, did you, the applicant, have a chance to review that Form I-589 that was prepared for you before it was submitted? Are you familiar with what's in there? And the officer will be asking if everything in there is true. The officer is very likely to be going through and asking you questions from that form. Even though you already filled it out, they may very well ask you some of the same questions that are on there, and they'll be comparing what you say with what's in your form. So a few things about that. It's important for you, before you go for your interview, to be looking over your form again and making sure that you remember what you put in there. If you're not a person who remembers all the dates on that form very well, and it may well be that you don't know your children's birth dates by heart, or your spouse's birth date, or the day you got married, you listed them in your form, you don't remember them by heart, you can let the officer know. Officer, I put these, I got these dates maybe from your documents. I don't remember them exactly myself. And that's okay, as long as you explain that to the officer. Also, if there are any changes that need to be made to the form, the officer will want to go through those with you. And they really like asking lots of very detailed questions from this form. And if there are any changes at all, they're going to want to make a note of that. So if you've moved since the time that you submitted the form, or you remember, oh, there was another place that I lived when I first got to the United States that I didn't list on the form, the officer will want to list that and make the change. And they're going to ask you at the end of the interview to sign the form with all the changes and attest that this is all true and correct. The officer is also going then to be asking you a lot of questions about why you're afraid to return to Afghanistan. So the officer will be looking at, if you submitted a declaration, like your own written out story, the officer will have that and be looking at that and using that as a way to understand your story and asking you questions based on that declaration. It's also important to know that the officer will be looking at the declaration and comparing what you say there in the interview with what you wrote in the declaration. And if anything is different that you're saying there, they're going to ask you about why that is. So it's also important for you, as you're preparing for your interview, to be familiar with what you put in your declaration. The officer will also ask you, did anyone help you prepare that? And so if somebody helped you prepare that, that's a good time to explain who that was and how that happened. The officer will want to know, did you have a chance to review your declaration? Is everything in here true? Are these all your words in this declaration? The officer is going to want to ask you details about things that might have happened to you in the past that would make you afraid to return home. If there were things that already happened to you, if you were ever harmed in Afghanistan or received threats, they're going to probably very likely be asking you a lot of detailed questions about who hurt you, why they hurt you, and it kind of exactly what happened and when this was. They will be asking you, if for instance, you're saying that you received threats from the Taliban, they're going to want to know, how did you know it was Taliban? And sometimes you may know that, sometimes it may be something that you assumed it was Taliban. Either way, you're going to want to explain to the officer either that you know this or why you think it was so. But you can absolutely expect that if you received any kind of serious harm already in Afghanistan, including threats, that the officer is going to have a lot of questions about those things. And the officer is also going to want to know, if you're afraid to return home and you're afraid of harm by the Taliban or any other group, why they would want to hurt you, and what about you would make the Taliban, for instance, want to hurt you? What is it about you? Is it the work that you did? Is it your ethnic group? Is it your political beliefs? Is it because of your family members? Is it because of your religious practice? What about you would make the Taliban want to hurt you? And then the officer is likely to want to know, how would the Taliban know that about you? And so even though some of these things might sometimes seem obvious, it's important to make sure that you explain fully these things to the officer. The officer is also going to ask you about things that could potentially bar you from asylum. And those would mean if you provided help or support to groups that the US considers terrorist groups like the Taliban, if you harmed or seriously harmed other people because of their race, their religion, their nationality, or their political opinions, or because they were part of particular social groups. If you lived outside of Afghanistan in another country where you had a legal status, the officer will ask you questions about that as well. You may also wonder, how long does this interview last? And there's not one answer to that. It could be anywhere from an hour to 5 or 6 hours. My overall estimate at this point, based on everything I've seen, is probably to estimate several hours at least. And if you have an interpreter involved, of course, that makes everything take longer, which is not to dissuade anyone or try to talk anyone out of using an interpreter. If you need an interpreter, it is very important. It's really important that you understand exactly what the officer is asking and that the officer understands exactly what you are saying. So if you're not fully comfortable in English, like if you're having any difficulties understanding what I'm saying, it might be worth thinking about, would it be more beneficial for you to have an interpreter at the interview? It's really important for you and the officer to understand each other. As Annalisa was explaining earlier, the officer is focusing very much on credibility, by which they mean, are you telling the truth? And so they're going to be listening carefully to your story and trying to understand, is the story you're telling consistent with itself? So are you saying one thing in one place and a totally different thing somewhere else? And they're also going to be looking at the documents you submitted and the declaration and the asylum application to see, are those things all consistent? So does the story all flow together? Is it all consistent? Or is it saying one thing here and another thing there? And so this is one of the reasons that having really making sure that the language doesn't get in the way is really important, because it would really be terrible for language issues to make it seem like there's an inconsistency that isn't actually there. So that brings us through kind of what questions the officer will ask. And Annalisa, at this point, you were going to share actually our mock interview section, right?
I do. I can also talk a little bit about how to answer those questions. So Jenny talked about a lot of really important questions that will come up. We talked about the fact that the officer is already going to have your I-589 form and your personal declaration in front of them. They will have read it before you walked in the room. They'll be referencing it as you talk to them. They'll be making sure that every single thing that you say is the same that you wrote in the I-589 form and the declaration form. And this is where that truthfulness is really, really important. So as Jenny said, before the interview, you really want to review those documents. If you don't speak English, or if you are not literate in English, please find someone who does speak or read English so they can help you understand exactly what is written in the forms that you submitted as part of your application, because that's how the officer will judge if you are telling the truth. If there's anything that's not correct in the application or in your statement and you realize that, you need to tell the officer before the interview begins. If it happens after the interview has already started or in the middle of the interview, it will cause questions, and that won't be very promising for the truthfulness. So it's very, very important that once you start the interview, that you know what's in the application, you know what it says, and that you are, as Jenny said, raising your hand and testifying that everything in there is true. So that's truthfulness is very important. How to answer the questions otherwise, listen very carefully to what the officer is asking you. And if you don't understand what they're saying, it's okay to say, I don't understand. Can you say that again? Can you ask that question differently? If you don't know the answer to a question, it's also okay to say, I don't know, or I'm not sure. That's okay. There may be some difficult questions. It's always important to answer with the truth. And some questions may seem silly or obvious, but just remember that that list of questions that the officer is going down are required of every applicant. And there's a legal reason that the officer has to ask them. So even if it seems obvious, like the officer should know this, they're an educated person, they should know what's going on in Afghanistan or any country, my home country, they do know. But the important thing is that they need to hear it from you. They need for you to be the one to say, this is what will happen to me if I go back, or this is what I'm afraid of in the future, or these are the things that happened to me in the past. And it's my unique story. It's not the story. It may be similar to a lot of other people's stories, but it's not exactly the same. Each and every one of you has a unique story. And Jenny mentioned the kinds of things the officers will ask about. So first, they're going to ask you a ton of information about the I-589 form. What's your name? What's your middle name? What's your father's name? What's your last name? What are your children's names? All those kind of very basic information. They're going to ask you again, all of those questions to make sure that everything they have on that form is correct. And if something's wrong, they'll just correct it during the interview. And it's okay. Oh, if we spelled your name wrong, or that's actually my brother's name, I meant it to be my sister. It's okay to tell the officer these things so that they can make sure to have everything correct. And as Jenny mentioned, there are two really important parts of qualifying for asylum. And that's talking about if you faced any past harm while you were still living in your home country, whether that's Afghanistan or somewhere else. So the officer will ask you, how was your life? What was your life like? Describe to them, describe any challenges that you faced in your normal day-to-day life. Some of you may have been harmed or threatened in the past. Maybe you weren't harmed or threatened in the past, but you're afraid of the future. And that's okay too. That's okay to be honest in that way as well. The next thing is that they'll ask you about, can you safely return to your home country? If the answer is yes, then they'll say why. If the answer is no, they'll say why. And so then they'll want to understand also if you have permanent residence in any other country. Is there any other country that you could safely go back to and live there permanently? If you said you cannot return to your home country, they're going to ask you why. They want to know, why can you not go back to Afghanistan? Why can you not go back to your home country? And you'll want to be truthful and specific about this. You'll want to tell the officer why you specifically cannot go back, or what will happen to you. What do you think might happen to you based on what you know of that's happening to people like you, as Jenny said. So these are kind of some of the things that we want you to keep in mind. And if you feel like you're repeating yourself to the officer, that's okay. Please try to be patient. I know this is a very difficult situation. Some of it may be emotional. I think Jenny mentioned you can take a break. You can request a break. Sometimes it's good to just kind of, take a breath, take a deep breath, take a sip of water. It can be very intense in these interviews, but please just be honest with the officer and what you're feeling, if you're feeling overwhelmed or anxious, and so they can try to help you. Now we'll get a quick look into a mock interview. This is a fake. Mock means fake, so not a real, it's a pretend interview that we'll be showing on the screen. This was recorded featuring our own Jenny and another asylum officer, former asylum officer, and then someone who is posing, pretending to be an applicant. And so you'll see a little bit of the discussion here. Stay tuned.
Myself, and then it was translated, and the attorney got the translated copy, and they asked me a couple more questions, but then at the end they reviewed it back with an interpreter in my native language, and everything was correct.
Okay, so you wrote your declaration in what language?
Dari?
And it was translated into English for your attorney to review, is that correct?
Yes.
And your attorney made changes to it?
No, the attorney just asked me some questions and I added more details.
Okay. And did somebody read your entire declaration back to you in Dari or in a language that you understand before you signed it?
Yes.
Okay. Did somebody read your complete asylum application back to you in a language that you understand before you signed it?
Yes.
So do you understand the contents of your application, including the form that you filed and all of the documents that you submitted with it?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Do you have any changes or corrections that you want to make now?
No.
Okay. So is the application, including the form, the declaration, and all of the evidence that you submitted with it, including everything, is that all true and correct and complete?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So now we're going to go over the form together. So let me just get your form ready. I'm sorry, one second. All right. So what is your true and complete name?
Abbas Mustafa Sarabi.
And have you ever used any other names?
Yes, I use different spellings, 2 different spellings. So Abbas Mustafa with a PH Sarabi and Abbas Mustafa Sarabi with 2 B's.
Okay, I see those are both noted here. Thank you. And what is your current address?
I actually moved from the address listed on the I-589. So my new address is 123 Sesame Street in Richmond.
Okay, when I asked you if you had any changes to make to the asylum application, and you told me that you didn't, when did you move?
It was just a couple of days ago, and my attorney assisted me to do the change of address.
You have already filed the AR11, a change of address form?
Yes, officer.
Okay, I will note the new address on the form. Are there any other changes you need to make to your application form?
No, officer.
Okay, let's continue then. Can you receive mail at that address, 123 Sesame Street?
Yep.
All right. And you've indicated that your gender is male, is that correct?
Correct.
And you are legally married, is that correct?
Correct.
And your birth date, please?
December 17th, 1982.
Okay. And the city and country where you were born?
Bamin, Afghanistan.
Okay. And so you are an Afghan national, born Afghan at birth. And what is your race or ethnicity, please?
I'm Hazara.
All right. And your religion?
I'm Muslim of the Shia sect.
Thank you. Have you ever had to go to immigration court in the United States? No, okay. When is the last time you left Afghanistan? What date?
August 25th, 2021.
Okay, and when did you enter the United States?
September 2nd, 2021.
And is this the first time that you've come to the United States?
Yes.
All right. And I see we have your I-94 in the file, which reflects that you were paroled under Operation Allies Rescue and that your status expires about 2 years from your entry. Okay. And so you have an Afghan passport. Let me just see your passport again. Check your passport number. And the expiration date looks good. Okay. So what is your native language?
Dari?
And are you fluent in English?
Yes, I am.
All right. What other languages do you speak fluently?
Pashto?
All right. Thank you. Okay. That's the first page of the I-589. So we'll move on for purposes of this mock interview to the testimony questions. So just a couple of follow-up questions before we get into your claim. So you said this is the first time you've entered the United States. Is it the first time you've left Afghanistan?
Yes, it is. Well, I studied in Pakistan, but that was only for 2 years and I only had a student visa. But then I went back and continued my studies in Afghanistan. But this is the first time I lived outside of Afghanistan for a while.
Okay. And have you left the United States since you entered?
No, I haven't.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about the reasons why you're afraid to go back to Afghanistan. Who are you afraid of in Afghanistan?
I'm afraid of the Taliban, which has taken over the entire country.
Is there anyone else whom you fear in Afghanistan?
The Taliban is a really large group, but I am scared of the Taliban.
Okay. Only the Taliban?
Yes, officer.
Okay. And what harm do you fear from the Taliban?
I'm terrified that they're going to torture me, kill my wife and my son if we're forced to return.
Okay. Why would they want to harm you specifically?
For me specifically, it's because I worked for a US-based nonprofit. I was a journalist. I reported against them. The nonprofit I worked for is Human Rights Foundation. I'm also Hazara, which is an ethnic minority. I'm also Shia, which is not the sect, the religious sect that the Taliban is. So based on.
Okay, hold on 1 second. Let me just make sure I'm getting that all down. Hold on. Okay, I'm sorry. And that last thing.
Thank you, Annalisa, for sharing that mock interview. And I'm going to try to go back to our to slides. We have one more slide to cover, and then we will be ready to take questions from everyone. So that was, again, a mock interview that you saw me there. I was playing the attorney, and you may be wondering, I wasn't doing a whole lot. And so if you do have an attorney, your attorney can come with you to the asylum interview. Mostly the attorney is going to be there taking notes. If something goes very wrong, they can say something and should. They're allowed to make a short statement at the end. And if you watch the whole video of our mock interview, you would have seen me making a short statement at the end. Sometimes the attorney can help pointing things out to the officer, but the attorney's role is really pretty limited during the asylum interview itself. But that was meant to give you a feeling for exactly what an asylum interview would be like. And in fact, the woman who was playing the asylum officer in that mock interview, she currently works for a nonprofit, but she used to be an asylum officer herself. So we hope that that was actually a fairly realistic portrayal of what an asylum interview would be like. Well, at least one section of it. So I'm going to try to go back to my screen here. Just to talk for a few minutes now, we've really walked you through everything that happens at the asylum interview to talk about how do you prepare for this. And so I think the most important things you can do really are, once you've submitted your application, to review your application and review your declaration and really be familiar with what you've put in those documents. Make sure if there are any changes that do need to be made, as Annalisa said, you can make those. And we saw during the mock interview that we watched just now, there were a few updates that the applicant had and was able to make during the interview. So you can let the officer know, and the officer really likes it. Usually if you can tell the officer up front of any changes that you need to make, so that they don't just come out while the officer is asking questions, and you can let the officer know at the very beginning that you have some changes. But it's very important to be very familiar with what is in your application, particularly your application form, the I-589, and this is a picture of the front of it right here, and your declaration. Also, any documents that you submitted to support your application, whether those are statements from other family members or work badges or photographs or screenshots of maybe a social media post or a video, whatever those personal documents for you are, you're going to be familiar with what they are, be able to explain to the officer what they are and where they came from. If you do have an attorney who prepared country conditions information or other documents like that, it's not necessary for the applicant to be totally familiar with what all those things are. But it's really important to be familiar with yourself, with what's in your application, to know what's in there and be able to explain it to the asylum officer. And again, to know if there are any changes that need to be made. The officer will be asking you, in all likelihood, at the beginning of the questioning about why you're afraid to return home, to explain in a few sentences why it is that you're afraid to return home. So it can also be good to think about what you might want to say to the officer about that, to help them really understand who you're afraid of and why you're afraid to return home. And then the officer will ask you many follow-up questions. So when they ask you at the beginning why you're afraid, you don't need to feel as if at that point you need to tell your whole story. In fact, the officer will stop you after a bit if your story takes a long time, because they're going to want to ask you many follow-up questions. So with that, Annalisa, is there anything else you want to add? And then we're going to go into responding to questions.
I think that was it for me, but we definitely have a few good questions in the queue.
Terrific.
Are you ready for those now, Jenny?
Yes, please.
All right. So thank you guys so much. And a reminder, you can still submit your questions down below in the Q&A using the Q&A button, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. One of them, I think, is a unique question that I don't have an answer to. So a few folks are asking, so of course, in the asylum application process, a witness or someone can submit an affidavit in support of your application. The question is, can someone who submitted a witness declaration or an affidavit of support also serve as the interpreter during the interview?
They cannot.
Jenny says no. Another similar question.
But actually, just to follow up on that, Annalisa, though, you
Yes.
can actually bring a witness with you to the interview. So it's not required, but if you have somebody who submitted a witness declaration who's here in the United States and you think it might be really important, you're allowed to bring them with you. The officer might or might not decide to ask them any questions. It's up to the officer, but if you do bring the witness, you can let the officer know that they're there and ready to come in and talk to the officer.
So witness can attend, but cannot serve as the interpreter.
Correct.
Hearing that correctly? Okay, great.
Yes.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
A similar question, can an adult child who is not included on the application, but is mentioned in the application, attend as the interpreter?
That's a really good question. And I actually think that, I mean, I've looked at the regulations on this, and what they say is that you can't be an interpreter if you're part of the case, you're a witness on the case, or if you're the attorney on the case, which leads me to believe that it should actually be possible for a family member who's not part of the case to be the interpreter.
So technically possible, unless they have their own active asylum case, right? In which case,
Exactly. Somebody with a
not
pending
possible.
asylum application, they will not allow to be the interpreter.
yeah. So hopefully that's clear. So the answer to that question is yes, adult child can be an interpreter as long as they do not have their own active asylum case. And I think I would caution, this is not official, but I would also just caution, you know, with having someone, a family member who's close to the story, the
Yeah.
role of the interpreter in these sessions is the only time they can speak at all is when they are exactly word for word translating what the officer or an applicant or an attorney are saying. They cannot add, alter, interject, or say anything on behalf of the family. And if they do, they will be removed from the interview. And if you've chosen someone who's close to your family and there's a risk of that, just, you know, you may want to choose a neutral interpreter just in case. Or if you do choose someone who is close to your family, please make sure that they understand the role of the interpreter, so you don't accidentally lose your interpreter during the interview and then are faced without translation.
I absolutely agree, Annalisa, and I always encourage people to find an interpreter that who doesn't personally know the story in that way, because I think it's actually, it happens quite often that people are trying to be helpful and end up including things that they know in what they're saying that aren't actually the words of the applicant, and not out of any, you know, desire to do something wrong, but out of a desire to be helpful, but it's not helpful. It's so important for the officer to understand exactly what the applicant, him or herself, is saying. And it's easier to make sure that that's the case if it's not a family member.
Thanks, Jenny. One other witness related question.
Mhm.
What exactly does the asylum office consider as a witness? Is it only people who already submitted statements or affidavits, or could it also be additional people who are testifying or answering questions at the interview?
That's a great question. To which I don't do, the answer would be like, will they allow somebody who hasn't submitted a statement in advance to come as a witness?
I believe so, yeah.
Yes.
That's the question.
I think so. It's really up to the officer to decide to what extent they're going to bring a witness in to ask questions. But if it's something that you think is really, really important for your case, I would absolutely let the officer know you think this is really, really important for your case, and you have the witness there waiting.
Great, thank you so much. Alrighty, next question. Did you say that the applicant should inform the officer of any known changes to the application prior to the start of the interview?
That's a great question. And when I say prior to the start, no, I mean, the officer, what'll happen when you walk into their office, and it's going to be just like a small office with a desk and probably a plexiglass that they have now from COVID, and their computer will be there. You will first go through the preliminaries of swearing to tell the truth. They'll, ask your name. And that could be a good, and when they start, the officer may tell you, there are going to be 3 parts to this interview. I'm going to first be asking you questions about your I-589. Then I will be asking you questions about why you're afraid to return home. And I'll be asking you some other questions about things that could bar you from asylum. And once they start on the questions about the I-589, that could be a time to say, officer, I have some changes. Another thing that you can do if you have a number of changes is to bring them written out for the officer. I think the officers generally appreciate that. It makes things easier for them. So that's something else you can do. If you have time, like several weeks in advance of the interview, you can also submit those. If you submitted your application online, for instance, you can upload changes there. If you submitted it on paper, there's a way to email the asylum office. If you actually just Google the name of your asylum office plus email, it'll pull up the email address for that office. You can do that, and then you can bring it on paper with you. Officers like that because things like that make their job easier and quicker. So.
Thanks, Jenny. I think that's really helpful. One clarification question is USCIS providing a translator for Afghans, or would they have to bring their own translators?
So that's a great question too. The answer is you don't have to bring your own, but they are strongly encouraging / pleading for people to bring their own because they are having trouble locating enough via their phone service. So you can go ahead, trying to use their interpreter, which will be over the phone. It'll only be over the phone. But again, they've been having trouble locating enough of them. And I have heard many reports from attorneys representing Afghan applicants about problems with the interpreters they've found. So all of this could combine to mean if you need an interpreter and you don't bring one, there's a chance that your interview could have to be rescheduled or that there could be a problem with the translator. But I also recognize, we all do, it's very hard to find an interpreter, and there's a huge need right now for Dari and Pashto speaking interpreters. And because they won't allow people with pending asylum applications, there aren't that many. So it's absolutely possible to use their interpreter. But again, if you can bring your own, that's a good idea.
Thanks, Jenny. This question is about, it says for applicants that have memory problems. So I'm guessing we're maybe talking about either an older person or someone who's incapacitated in some way. Is it acceptable by the asylum officer that the applicant bring his or her family member to help during the interview?
Somebody who is like, that's an excellent question that I'm not sure I'm going to be able to give you like the absolute final answer on that right now. But one thing I will say is that if there is some medical condition that prevents somebody from testifying, that's probably something you're going to want to have some kind of documentation from a doctor that explains what the problem is with the person's memory. So, Annalisa, I don't know if you have anything further to add.
I was going to say exactly the same thing, that if there's a disability or any kind of memory problems due to dementia, perhaps there needs to be medical documentation of that. Otherwise, I think the expectations will be that they're able to testify for themselves, and the officer may be understanding, but I think it's very important that there's evidence to support that. And then just in the end, Jenny nor I know, it's always going to be up to the USCIS officer's discretion if they will allow the witness or not. I would recommend them bringing someone, but also bringing the evidence. For sure, they'll need the evidence for the officer to even consider allowing someone else to help.
Exactly.
A few more. We have a couple more minutes. Let's see. I got this one as well. So the question was, I am fluent in English, but my wife is not. Should I bring an interpreter?
That's an excellent question. So then that kind of gets to the question of what kind of questions will your wife be asked at the interview?
Yes.
And I actually didn't mention that, and probably I should have. So I mentioned that you have to bring your spouse and children. They will be asked some questions, but not a lot. So what will happen is, if you are going to the interview with your spouse and or your children, the officer will want to see them, and hopefully they can do this at the beginning. They'll need to see them physically, face-to-face, verify their identity. And then for your spouse, they're going to have a few questions for her. And those are going to be about just verifying her identity, who she is, and then asking her the questions about things that could bar you from asylum. And so they have a list of questions that they have to read. They ask these of everyone. And I mentioned a few things. They're also going to ask questions about crimes, like were you convicted of a crime anywhere in the world? Have you been accused of a crime, arrested for a crime anywhere in the world, in the United States? Have you ever done anything that could be considered terrorist activities or provided any kind of support to terrorists? Have you ever lived in another country outside the United States? They're going to be asking these questions to your spouse. So if your spouse is not able to answer those in English, you would need an interpreter for that portion of the interview.
I agree. Same with children. And they'll, similar to going over the I-589 with you, they'll also go over that with your spouse. So what is your name? What is your birth date? What are your parents' names? They'll be asking all of those questions of your spouse and children. If they don't understand, then they'll run into problems. So I would advise an interpreter in that situation. I know we're out of time, but one similar question is, how will minors be questioned during the interview if they don't know a lot of details and they're too young to have details?
Yeah, that's a great question. Your minor children should not be interviewed about the substance of the application. They are not required to talk about that unless you have a child who is providing some kind of witness statement. And I would hope at that point that that's a child who's like 18, 19, 20. So even, technically a child for asylum purposes, but not a little kid. But if your child is not going to be interviewed about the substance of the application, nor will your spouse. That said, those questions about crimes and terrorism, they may ask some of those questions to your children, especially if they're teenagers. I would expect them to do that. Really little children, no. But they
Right,
may
it'll
ask
probably
some of those,
be,
Pardon?
what's your name? How old are you?
Yeah.
That's typically the type of question asked of children.
But
Children.
But I have heard that they do sometimes ask some of the asylum bars questions, the things that could prevent you from getting asylum for children, especially if they're teenagers.
That's absolutely correct.
But they will not be interviewing your young child about why you are afraid to return to Afghanistan and any harm that you might have suffered there or reasons that you're afraid to return home. They should not be asking your spouse or children those things. Again, unless they've submitted a document as a witness in the case, but otherwise they should not be asked those things.
That's all true. Well, Jenny, we are at 2:01. I think we addressed a number of the substantive questions. I know there are a couple more, and what we can do is probably find another way to answer a few of these for the public. And Jenny, could you remind folks about the recording?
Yep, we have been recording this to share out with other asylum applicants, and we're going to continue holding these sessions again, and we are also planning at some point in the not too distant future to offer the same session in Dari and in Pashto. So, and we'll be sending that information out and circulating it the same way we did this. Thank you all for being here. I hope this was helpful. Thank you so much, Annalisa, and to the Welcome Legal Alliance for making this possible.
Thank you, everyone.